This is a moment in Jewish history. Once I got into a debate with a friend over Mark Twain and his historical writings about his trip to the land of Israel, published back in 1869. I said it was an important record of what life was like in Israel back then, underdeveloped, underpopulated. He said it was embarrassing and would rather people not read about how Mark Twain found the Holy Land to be desolate and dismal. He found the descriptions of crumbling historic places and sparse arid landscapes to be insulting. Well, I'll let you, the listeners, decide. Here's a choice excerpt. "We traveled some miles of desolate country, whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. Gray lizards, those heirs of ruin, of sepulchres and desolation, glided in and out among the rocks or lay still and sunned themselves. Where prosperity had reigned and fallen, where glory had flamed and gone out, where beauty has dwelt and passed away, where gladness was and sorrow is, where the pomp of life has been and silence and death brood over its high places, there this reptile makes his home." Now, I have often seen these little lizards scampering in and out of rocks, but for me, they are near the constantly growing independent new country of Israel. The historic ruins have been preserved, and now are tourist sites, and Israel has become a high-tech nation with startup companies and a thriving economy, despite the political and security situation. Many of my past shows have been about how pioneers came to this desolate land and built things like hospitals, the electric company, the airport, and other firsts. You can check out benbresky.substack.com to learn more from past episodes. But I guess I can understand why someone would be offended by that master of wit, Mark Twain, because throughout the book, The Innocents Abroad, he describes the poverty and squalor not only in the land of Israel, but in the other countries he visited during his trip, including European countries. Here's another example. The celebrated Sea of Galilee is not so large a sea as Lake Tahoe by a great deal. It is just about 2/3 as large, and when we come to speak of beauty, is no more to be compared to Tahoe than a meridian of longitude is that to a rainbow. The dim waters of this pool cannot suggest the limpid brilliance of Tahoe. I measure all lakes by Tahoe, partially because I am far more familiar with that than any other, and partially because I have such a high admiration for it. Earlier in Mark Twain's book, he also complains about lakes in France and Italy not being as nice as Lake Tahoe, which is located in California and Nevada. Mark Twain was already well known before publishing The Innocents Abroad, but it is one of his earlier works, published years before his famous novels, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and The Prince and the Pauper, books you probably read as a child. Born Samuel Clemens, he wrote about life in the American South and was famous as an essayist and public speaker. He was also known for his biting wit, which comes through in The Innocents Abroad, in which he describes with dismay his fellow travelers who were much more enraptured with the beauty of the Holy Land than he was, and he also frequently mocks an earlier writer who waxes poetically about how inspirational the land of Israel was to visit. I have read these and other travelogues of the era, and they all generally paint the same picture. The land of Israel was in fact undeveloped and sparsely populated, with none of the things found in other countries at the time, such as plumbing, accessible medical care, or any sort of modern technology. It was not until the Jewish people began returning in large numbers that the region took a step out of the previous century. The difference is in the tone. Let's read some more of how Mark Twain described Israel in the 1860s. "Stirring scenes occur in this valley no more. There is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent, not for 30 miles in either direction. There are 2 or 3 small clusters of tents, but not a single permanent habitation. One may ride 10 miles hereabouts and not see 10 human beings. To this region, one of the prophecies is applied. I will bring the land into desolation, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Like my grapes, which the spies bore out of the promised land, I have got everything in Palestine on too large a scale. Some of my ideas were wild enough. The word Palestine always brought to my mind a vague suggestion of a country as large as the United States. I suppose it was because I could not conceive of a small country having so large a history. I think I was a little surprised to find that the Grand Sultan of Turkey was a man of only ordinary size. When I was a boy, I somehow got the impression that the River Jordan was 4,000 miles long and 35 miles wide. It is only 90 miles long, and so crooked that a man does not know which side of it he is half the time. It is not any wider than Broadway in New York. Now let's compare Mark Twain's description of Jerusalem with that of one of the writers he mocks. Here's Mark Twain. At last, away in the middle of the day, ancient bits of wall and crumbling arches began to line the way. We toiled up one more hill, and every pilgrim and every sinner swung his hat on high. Jerusalem. Perched on its eternal hills, white and domed and solid, massed together and hooped with high gray walls, the venerable city gleamed in the sun. So small. Why, it was no larger than an American village. Jerusalem numbers only 14,000 people. We dismounted and looked, without speaking a dozen sentences, across the wide intervening valley for an hour or more, and noted those prominent features of the city that pictures make familiar to all men from their school days till their death. We could recognize the Mount of Olives, the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the Tower of David, and the Garden of Gethsemane. A fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in an hour. The streets are roughly and badly paved with stone and are tolerably crooked. I have several times seen cats jump across the street from one shed to the other when they were out calling. The cats could have jumped double the distance without extraordinary exertion. I mention these things to give an idea of how narrow the streets are. Since a cat can jump across them without the least inconvenience, it is hardly necessary to state that the streets are too narrow for carriages. These vehicles cannot navigate the holy city. The population of Jerusalem is composed of Muslims, Jews, Greeks, Latins, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, Abyssinians, Greek Catholics, and a handful of Protestants. The shades of nationality comprised in the above list and the languages spoken by them are altogether too numerous to mention. It seems to me that all races and colors and tongues of the earth must be represented among the 14,000 souls that dwell in Jerusalem. Rags, wretchedness, poverty, and dirt, those signs and symbols that indicate the presence of Muslim rule more surely than the crescent flag itself, abound. Lepers, cripples, the blind, and the idiotic. Jerusalem is mournful and dreary and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. Well, today it is a different story, although I have seen many cats in the old city of Jerusalem, and every time I see one jump from rooftop to rooftop, I think of Mark Twain. But now let's compare his description to that of Tent Life in the Holy Land by the American writer William Cowper Prime, published in 1857, a book that Mark Twain makes fun of. I visited the sacred soil as a pilgrim. To the whim of every passing hour, I prayed or I laughed, to which my voice made the moonlit streets of Jerusalem ring as I strolled across them, or to which I sent floating over the holy waves of the Galilee. Sending our horse homeward, we walked through the Jews' quarter, which is on Mount Zion. Many pretty faces, bright black eyes, and olive complexions looked out on us from the doors and windows as we went by, but we saw no men. It occurred to me then that it was Friday, and they would doubtless be found at the place of wailing. I was never more thoroughly lost than now in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and, the men being all absent, I could not find a person who understood Arabic or any European language that I could speak. At length I succeeded in getting a boy to understand that I wanted to go to the Jewish place of prayer, and he led us into their principal synagogue. As the sun was going westward and the Sabbath day rapidly approaching, we hastened toward the place of wailing. I found my own way up one street, down another, alley after alley, and at last emerged suddenly a small paved court or place 70 or 100 feet long by 20 broad, the east side of which was the high wall of massive stones on the west side of the enclosure, which is without doubt the same wall that stood here enclosing the temple in the days of its great glory. In this place the Jews are accustomed to assemble, and with low murmurs of prayer to bewail the desolation of the holy places. Moslem rule forbids their nearer approach to their once holy hill, but this little spot for many centuries has been hallowed by their adorning grief. The impression made on my mind by the scene here witnessed will never be effaced. I think it's important to contrast the experience of going to the Western Wall today with what it was like back in the mid-1800s. Now let's talk about Mark Twain's comments on the Jewish people, in which I will conclude with his famous quote. Mark Twain returned to traveling, and while in Europe, sent an article to Harper's Magazine in 1898, where he describes a debate in Parliament in which several elected officials insulted each other by calling one another Jew. He quotes a politician named Wohlmeyer as calling another, "You Jew, you," and another stating, "I would rather take my hat off to a Jew than to Wolf." Twain writes, "As to the makeup of the House, it is this. The deputies come from all walks of life and from all grades of society. There are princes, counts, barons, priests, peasants, mechanics, laborers, lawyers, judges, physicians, professors, merchants, bankers, shopkeepers. They are religious men, they are earnest, they are sincere, devoted, and they hate the Jews." He adds, "The Jews and Germans were harried and plundered, and their houses destroyed. In other Bohemian towns there was rioting, in some cases the Germans being the rioters, in others the Czechs, and in all cases the Jews had to roast no matter which side he was on." This article prompted him to write a follow-up concerning the Jews. I knew a rabbi in America from a very religious black hat background who carried the final paragraph of Concerning the Jews in his wallet. But before we get there, I must talk about Clara Clemens, the concert singer and daughter of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. She married the Russian-born pianist and conductor Ossip Gabrilowitsch, founding director of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, which means that Mark Twain had a Jewish son-in-law, and according to his biography, considered Ossip a real man. One story is told that he saved his bride from a horse that had gone out of control, spraining his ankle in the process. And now we come to Concerning the Jews, published in Harper's in 1899. It begins with a letter Twain received from a Jewish man who expressed dismay at the prejudice against the Jewish people from Twain's previous article about the Parliament in Austria. The letter writer asks Twain, "Tell me therefore from your vantage point of cold view, what in your mind is the cause? Can American Jews do anything to correct it either in America or abroad? Will it ever come to an end? Will a Jew be permitted to live honestly, decently, and peaceably like the rest of mankind? What has become of the Golden Rule?" Now, once again, there are those who will take portions of Mark Twain's essay and say that it was actually insulting to the Jewish people. If you, the listener, have any thoughts, please email me. Here is how Mark Twain responds, giving an example of illogical prejudice against the Jewish people. In Berlin a few years ago, I read a speech which frankly urged the expulsion of Jews from Germany, and the agitator's reason was as frank as his proposition. It was this, that 85% of the successful lawyers in Berlin were Jews, and that about the same percentage of the great and lucrative businesses of all sorts in Germany were in the hands of the Jewish race. Isn't that an amazing confession? It was but another way of saying that in a population of 48 million, of whom only 500,000 were registered as Jews, 85% of the brains and honesty of the whole was lodged in the Jews. The man claimed that in Berlin, the banks, the newspapers, the theaters, the great mercantile, shipping, mining, and manufacturing interests, the big army and city contracts, the tramways, and pretty much all the properties of high value, and also the small businesses, were in the hands of the Jews. The argument is that the Christian cannot compete with the Jew, and that hence his very bread is in peril. To human beings, this is a much more hate-inspiring thing than is any detail connected with religion. With most people, of a necessity, bread and meat take first rank, religion second. I'm convinced that the persecution of the Jew is not due in any large degree to religious prejudice. Can the Jews do anything to improve the situation? I think so. If I may make a suggestion without seeming to be trying to teach my grandmother how to suck eggs, I will offer it. Suppose you try a scheme like this, for instance. In England and America, put every Jew on the census book as a Jew. In case you have not been doing that, get up volunteer regiments composed of Jews. Next, in politics, organize your strength, band together, and deliver the casting vote where you can, and where you can't, compel as good terms as possible. Speaking of concentration, Dr. Herzl has a clear insight into the value of that. Have you heard of his plan? He wishes to gather the Jews of the world together in Palestine, with a government of their own. At the convention in Bern last year, there were delegates from everywhere, and the proposal was received with decided favor. To conclude, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, and has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. He contributes to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also a way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed, and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up, and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? This has been a moment in Jewish history. For questions or comments, you can visit benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and Shalom.